Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone, and welcome back to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode, well, guess what? We're back with more Linux command line stuff. Joining us back in the studio yet again, our good friend, Mr. Don Pezet. Don, we're so glad to have you again. How's it going today?
It is going great, and thank you for the chance to come back and cover all the stuff that I didn't get to in the last episode, which there were a couple of things that we wanted to tackle, but we're going to continue our adventure with manipulating files, right? We spent our time in the last episode reading files, redirecting output, and kind of messing around with them. But there's a lot more that we can do that are basic shell commands. We're going to take a look at them right here in this episode.
Now, Don, you made a great point that when we were creating our files, we were basically kind of using commands or redirecting that output into a file, and that's where the file creation came from. But what if, and hang with me here, follow me if you will, what if I just want to create a file with a file name, but it's empty? I just want an empty file so that I can manipulate it later.
Yeah, it's actually pretty easy to create a file, and usually we don't just create an empty file. We use a program that generates data so that we save it. And if we don't have data, there's not really a whole lot of need for a placeholder. But there are times that we want to create placeholders, and usually it's with folders. I want to create a bunch of directories that are there so people can start to put their documents. I might need to set permissions before people put their documents there. So we need to know how to go about doing those things. How we can create these files, create these placeholders so we can have permissions set on them ahead of time, right? And one of the easiest ways to do it is using the touch command. Touch is a command that lets you, well, in the past, it would just make a subtle alteration to a file. Every file has a timestamp, right? And the timestamp reflects the last time that it was modified. So for example, if I look in my little lab folder here, I'm going to do a ls-lh. I want the long output, and I want the size as human readable. But when I look, there's this September 21st, 1026 on binaries, and September 21st, 1024 on bootlog. Right? What that means is that these files were last modified on September 21st at 1024 and 1026 versus the Moby Dick file that was modified much earlier at 953. Right? Those are the timestamps. And the touch command allows you to touch a file, which doesn't actually change it, but it does update the timestamp to now. Right? That was its original intent. But we can actually use the touch command to create our own files as well. So maybe I want to start creating some memos. And I want Daniel to be able to come in and edit the memos as well. So I need to set some permissions on them ahead of time before I've actually put anything in there. So I might want to create a file called memo.txt, right? And I'll throw that in there. And you know, let me make a quick clarifying statement here. Stanley in the chat room had a good comment. I keep doing file extensions, which is really a carryover to the old Microsoft days, but most people do them. Remember that in the Linux and Unix world, we're not beholden to file extensions. You don't have to have them. That we typically do them as a way to let people know what the type of data is in the file, but it actually has no bearing. It's what?
A courtesy.
Oh yeah.
Like, because a lot of times we're like, what kind of file is this? What do I open it with? So those extensions can help us.
Yeah, because there is a risk that maybe it's not a text file at all. Maybe it's a binary, and if I open that, it's going to cause various problems. And so by placing an extension on that, we've kind of got that note. And what Stanley in the chat room was mentioning was that if we don't have an extension, it still works, but you can use the file command to see what kind of data is in there. So if I do like file mobydick.txt, it tells me it's ASCII text. If it tells me it's a binary, I don't want to go messing with the file. The file needs to be left alone, but if it tells me it's text, then it's okay to manipulate. So, but anyhow, I do the extensions. Most people do just because it's that kind of flag to let people know what's in there. So when I ran touch memo.txt, what it did is it made a completely empty file called memo.txt, all right? And if I do the ls-lh and look at it right there, I can tell that it's completely empty. There's nothing in it. It's got a 0 byte size. In fact, if I were to use that file command on it and run it against it, it can't tell me whether it's a binary or not because it's completely empty. So it just tells me, it's empty. You can do whatever you want with this file, right? So I just created a placeholder by using that touch command. And now I can manipulate that file however I need to. I can set permissions or whatever, and then we can flow data into it and get it in there. Now, the touch command by itself is really, really simple. You just provide a file name and that's it. But you can take advantage of some other bash technologies here to really do some fun stuff. So for example, let's say that I wanted to create 5 memos. memo1.txt, memo2.txt, memo3.txt, memo4.txt, memo5.txt. I could run each one of those. I could say touch and then each entry. Or in the bash prompt, we can actually do what's called expansion, where I can send it one command that's then run multiple ways depending on a field of values, right? And I know that sounds confusing, so let me show you an example of what I'm talking about. I could say touch memo and then do a curly brace, which is the little squiggly bracket or whatever on your keyboard. I'll do a curly brace, and I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'll close that curly brace, and I'll put .txt. Okay. What's going to happen is bash is going to see that. My shell is going to see the curly braces and say, wait a minute, this isn't the name of the file anymore. This is an expansion. What Don is actually saying is memo1.txt, memo2.txt, memo3.txt. It's going to interpret that, and it's going to run it. I ran one command. It's actually going to run it 5 times, though assuming I did it right. And so if I take a look, sure enough, there I've got memo1 through memo5. Let me get that as a list. So I can see each one was created, and they're right there in place. So if I'm creating placeholder directories or placeholder files like this, usually we're creating a lot of them, and a simple expansion like this can be really, really handy. I mean, you can even get really advanced. You can do more than one expansion, right? Maybe I'm creating schedules for 3 people. So I'm going to do me, Daniel, and Ronnie. And I want to have a morning and an afternoon schedule for everybody. So I want Don-morning, Don-afternoon, Ronnie-morning, Ronnie-afternoon. So that would be a lot of files to create. If there's 2 schedules and 3 people, it'd be 6 files I've got to create. But I could do it all right here in one command. I could say touch, and then I'm going to do Don, Ronnie, Daniel, right? There's my first expansion, right? And then I'm going to say dash and a second expansion where I'll say morning, afternoon, right? And then if I want to stick an extension on there or whatever, I can leave it off. And it'll create those, and it's going to run the commands. It'll take it and run Don-morning, Don-afternoon. Then it'll do Ronnie-morning, Ronnie-afternoon. Then it'll do Daniel-morning, Daniel-afternoon. More than one expansion happening here at the same time. And when I run that and take a look at it, there I can see the 2 Daniel schedules, the 2 Don schedules, and the 2 Ronnie schedules all created in place. And that's doing what's called an expansion. I'm expanding text inside of a command into more than one command. And that really does save us time. I'm doing it here with the touch command. You can do this with really any command. Any time that you're manipulating multiple files, expansion can really save you a lot of effort to be able to grab those files and act upon them. I kind of did it the hard way, like when I made those memos, where I did memo 1 through 5, I listed each one individually. It does support ranges. So like if I wanted to create 6 through 9, I could come in here and say memo 6 .9, you do double dots to indicate the range. And by doing that, I don't have to list every number in between, right? So now it's going to be a range of numbers that it'll create. And when I do that and take a look at it, now I've got 6 through 9 created. And by doing a range, you could go into the hundreds or thousands, and it would whip out 1,000 files just like that. Really, really easy. All the other commands we're going to see in this episode, like copy and move and stuff, they work with these expansions as well. So this is a really handy technique to learn to make it easy to work with large amounts of files.
All right, Don, well, let's go down that road. Let's talk about copying files. We've created some files. We know how to make that happen. It's pretty simple, and you've given us some really great power in which to make making multiple files very, very easy. Let's say I've plugged in a USB drive, I've made some files here, and I want to make a backup of them. I want to copy them to my USB drive. How would I do that?
All right, so the files we've made so far are empty, which is pretty lame.
Yeah.
So normally we want to make a file that has some data in it, and a lot of times we're getting that data from somewhere else. And so the copy command can be used to reach out and grab that data from somewhere else and place it into our file. The copy command is pretty straightforward. The command itself is actually CP, right? In the original Unix days, they would just take a verb and drop the vowels out of it, and Y sometimes counts as a vowel. So the O and the Y disappear and you get CP. They didn't always do that. So like when you want to make a directory, they didn't just do MD, it's MKDIR, the I is still there. So it's not always that way, but the original commands are usually just 2 letters like this, CP. And if I want to copy a file, I then specify the source of the data and then the destination. So maybe I want to copy mobydick.txt into just a file.txt, right? The source is mobydick.txt, the destination is file.txt. And so when I run that, it's just going to copy one to the other. So now I have 2 copies of Moby Dick. And if I do ls-lh, I can see Moby Dick right here at 1.2 megs, and I can see file.txt here at 1.2 megs also. Now from that respect, it's pretty simple. But let's think back to our navigating the file system episode, because normally the file that you're copying is going to be copied to somewhere else. I'm copying from one location to another location. So I might want to make a backup of a log file that's available somewhere. So maybe I want to edit it. I don't want to edit a real log file. So if I get into like /var/log, and I look around in here for a log file, like the messages file, or actually I probably don't have access to that. Let me make sure that it's a file I have access to here, dmessage, right? I could do cp dmessage because I'm in this folder, and then I might want to copy that, whoops, I might want to hold the right key here. I might want to copy that to my home folder, and I could type that out, /home/dpossess/lab/bootlog.txt, right? I'm copying from the source location to the destination. And remember that all the aliases that you have work. So instead of /home/dpossess, I could have done /lab/bootlog.txt, and that's going to copy it and paste it there, right? I was able to say that I was copying dmessage because there's a file called dmessage right here, and I just happened to already be in that folder. I was in that directory. But what if I wasn't? If I wasn't in that directory, if I was somewhere else, like in my home directory, then I would need to do full paths for these guys. I would need to say that I'm copying /var/log/dmessage, right, or dmessage.old, whichever one I was grabbing. I'll do dmessage, and I want to send it to /lab/bootlog.txt, and I can run that, and it copies it over. Okay. Now, quick note here: each time that I copied it, I've been overwriting the same file each time. It never warned me, did it? Right? Copy does not warn you. It just overwrites. So be careful with that. If you're trying to append, this is not the way that you do it. Or if you don't know if there's data there or not, you should go ahead and check before you do this. It doesn't give you a warning. It assumes that you know what you're doing. and that's not always the case. And I do know some people who actually take a safety measure. There's a command line argument with copy. I think it's -i. Let's find it here real quick. Yeah, -i. It's interactive, right? That makes it prompt before overwrite. And so a lot of administrators, people who perform sensitive actions, a lot of times they will alias the cp command to always use -i. And when you do that, if the file already exists, it'll warn you and it'll say, ooh, are you sure you want to overwrite this? And maybe you are. Yeah, I know what I'm doing. Yes, stop asking me. Or maybe you didn't, and you're like, oh, well, I need to double check that. And you can say no. It gives you that chance to stop. But CP by default does not give you that warning.
Yeah, I think that's a really great option, especially because when you're typing, it's really easy to what we like to call fat finger and do the wrong thing. So just having that little extra set of training wheels on, make sure that you don't overwrite a file that you don't want overwritten, can definitely be very helpful. But we've talked about copying files. What if I'm like, okay, this file is great, but it doesn't belong here. I need to move it somewhere else. I want to move the file and not just copy it and have 2 versions of it.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? When we copy a file, you end up with 2 copies, right? Well, not really 2 copies. You end up with an original and 1 copy, right? So you end up with 2 duplicates.
Yeah.
I don't know, whatever the right terminology. You get 2 files, right? Yeah. So if I want to move it somewhere else, that's a different story, right? So let's say that I have an all-new lab. So I'm going to make a directory called lab2. And my files are in just lab, right? So my files are right here. I want these to be in lab 2 instead, but I don't want them to stay here. I want to move them over to lab 2. Well, instead of CP, we just use the move command, MV, right? And after that, the syntax is really the same. I want to move these files to another location. Now, when you move, you typically are specifying a directory as a destination, right? Especially if you're moving more than 1 file. If I want to move all of these files, right, I can say MV*. I want to move everything in this folder. and I want to send that to /lab2, right? And I have to be careful here, because how does the system know if lab2 is a folder or if lab2 is a file? Do I want to move all these into a file called lab2? It doesn't necessarily know. If I want to move it into a folder, I need to make sure I throw a trailing slash on there. And now it knows, oh, you're not talking about a file called lab2. You're talking about a folder called lab2. You want to move everything in this folder over into this other folder. Or I could say an individual file, right? If I wanted to move binaries.txt, I could just move that one. I want to move the whole thing. So I'm going to move everything in here into lab2. And when I run that, now the lab folder is empty. ls returns nothing. But if I pull a directory listing for lab2, there's all the files, right? So I've only got one copy of these files. They've been moved over to the other location, and that's where they are. Now, a couple of interesting kind of sides on this. First off, move is great for moving things to other directories, but you can also use move to rename a file. In the Unix and Linux world, there is no rename command, right? In Windows, I think it's actually called rename, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
So you have a command line utility there. In the Unix and Linux world, we don't need that, because you can just use move, right? If I want to rename, I've got memo.txt. Maybe I want that to be memo0.txt, right? It's the very first one, so I want it to be memo0. So I could say move memo.txt to memo0.txt, right? I'm moving the file. The old file goes away, the one that was called memo.txt, and the new file is now called memo0.txt. So I'm basically renaming a file by using move. But in the file system, I'm technically moving it to a new location, and it just happens to have a new name in that new location. But now if I take a look at what's in here, I've got that memo0, and the one that's just plain old memo.txt is gone. And this whole time, I've been copying and moving files, but we can copy and move directories as well, right? So for example, let's say I got rid of the lab folder. So I just did a rmdir to remove directory. I removed the lab folder. And I've got the lab2 folder that has all of my files. And I decide, that was kind of dumb. So I want to rename it back to just lab again, okay? Or I want to move it somewhere else on my hard drive. Well, you can use the move command, and you can move a folder, right? I can say I want to move /lab2 to /lab, right? So I'm moving that one, and actually I'm already in the folder, so I could have just said like that without a path at all. I'm a bit of a stickler for path names, and the reason is I started, my Unix experience really started on Solaris. And in the Solaris world, it was really particular about paths. So like if you wanted to move something that was in the folder that you were in, you actually had to say like / so that it would really know what you're talking about. I'm talking about something right here in this folder, not something in the path that's stored somewhere else on my hard drive. I'm being really particular. So I out of habit, it's actually hard for me to break that.
Old habits die hard, they say, Don.
So a lot of times I'll type paths when I don't necessarily need them. But here, if I want to move lab2 to lab, I can just do that. And when I look, there it is. It's moved it, and it's brought that over, okay? Now, this can be a little problematic sometimes. For example, with the copy command, if I have multiple directories inside of something, so for example, inside of lab, inside of the lab folder, maybe I have another directory called test1 or test2, right? And inside of test1, I might have a bunch of files, right? So I'll do files 1.20.txt, all right? And so I've got all these files inside of here. And then I've got files inside of lab. And if I want to copy all of those, so maybe I have some kind of a directory that's, lab.backup. And so I want to have a backup of all of my lab files right here, okay? Well, when I do CP and I go to copy a folder, it's not going to get those subfolders. It's not going to get those items underneath it. I need to tell it that I want it to do that. And in the copy command, you have a tag, or a command line argument, which is a -r. And if we find it right here, -r, it makes it recursive. In other words, don't just get the parent directory, get the directories inside of it, get all the stuff that's inside, follow that tree all the way down to get what's inside of there. And that recursion is really handy when you're doing a backup like this. I might want to do a CP of /lab, and I might want to copy that to /lab.backup, okay? But when I do it, I want that to be recursive. So I'm going to add a -r to make sure it gets the subfolders as well. And when I run that and I look inside of my backup, oh shoot, I grabbed the lab file itself, sorry. I specified /lab literally, and I meant to do a /star after that to get everything that's inside of it, which I did not do. So anyhow, now I have a lab, which I can move these to fix it or whatever.
Yeah.
But now there they are, and the subfolder went along with it, and it got everything that was inside of that. Okay. So what I should have done in that command, there's a few ways to run it, right? And what I should have done is said that I want to copy from what's in that folder to in this other folder. And you can do that by doing a /star like that, saying get all the contents of the folder. But I copied the folder itself, and so that's why it kind of put it inside of this other one. So I should have done a /star in this case. That would have brought it over, as well as all the subdirectories, and put things where I actually wanted them to be, which was right here. So little things like that, right? Just a subtle positioning of a character, or you leave one thing out and it actually performs quite a different task.
It's kind of funny. It really happens a lot because, like we talked about fat fingering, guess what? That's what's going on here. You just get a little bit rushed and you're thinking, oh man, I've created a bunch of files I don't actually need, or it's the wrong name. I could do renaming, but sometimes I'm just like, you know what? I just want to start from scratch. Let me blow that away. I want to delete the files, or it's just information that I no longer need for whatever reason. I don't want to delete the files. Don, can you show us how we can delete files?
Absolutely. So, following our 2-letter commands, we've got RM for remove. So we had CP for copy, MV for move, RM for remove or delete. So I can say RM and then a file. So maybe I want to get rid of memo.txt or memo0. I'll do memo0.txt. And so I'm going to remove that one. And now when I pull up my listing, memo0 is gone, right? RM just worked. Now, when you go to remove files, you do have to be a little bit careful. You can remove many files at once. I can say RM star, and that'll delete it all, right? When I do that, it's going to delete, and see how it got some errors? RM doesn't work so well on directories, right? It throws an error. It says, you can't remove that. It's a directory. There might be stuff inside of it. And if I pull up a listing, though, it did get rid of everything else. All that's left are the directories. So that's good, right? But how do I get rid of a directory if it's got stuff inside it? Well, technically, you could go inside the directory, delete everything from inside of there and come out. You could use the rmdir command, which is remove directory, right? If I do that, if I try and remove directory lab, it's not empty. So now I have to go into the directory, remove some items, come out of the directory, use rmdir to delete the directory, and then go from there. It's a lot of work, okay? So what we can do is we can change the rm command a little bit to make it a bit more aggressive and say, I don't care what those files are, delete them, right? If you do rm-r, remember what rm-r did for CP? It made it recursive. It went into subfolders, right? I can do that with rm-r, right? I can say rm-r lab, right? And now it's going to go, and it doesn't complain about it being a directory, right? It says, okay, I'm fine with that being a directory, but it, or no, yeah, so, sorry, I was an exception, but in this case, I don't have the exception. So yeah, so it works, it removes it, and there we go. There is an exception. Every now and then you can hit where there's like a protected file or something that stops you from being able to delete it. And it didn't happen for me. I thought it was going to, and it didn't. So rm-r worked perfect. But if you hit one of those exceptions where there's files under there that maybe you're the owner of, but the permissions have been changed to read only or something like that, it might stop you. And if you ever encounter that, you can change the command just a little bit. Maybe I want to get rid of test 1 and 2. So I'm going to use an expansion so that I can delete test 1 and test 2 at the same time. Or you could actually write them out. I could say test 1, test 2 like that. It works either way. But the expansion is just a little bit short. I think it's like 1 keystroke short. So if I want to remove those, you can do an rm-rf, and that F says to force it. Now this is one we have to be careful with because basically we're taking off the safety gloves here, and it's saying, I don't care what I encounter underneath. As long as you're the owner or you have the permission to mess with it, we're going to toast it and get it out of there. So that's what rm-rf does. This is the command that I run when I want to just get something going and I don't want to be bothered with error messages. Like, just do it, get rid of it. And when I run that, it's going to go through and purge it, and now all of those folders are gone. Okay, so -R made it recursive. That's what got me around the directory problem. -RF made it force and just get past any kind of blocks to say we're going to remove. Now, we do still have that permission. You can't delete something you don't have permission to. So force isn't magic. It's just there's some things that you may have set yourself to have read-only permission, and that's what it'll get around. So a couple of different manipulations there on that RM command to remove the data and get it out of there.
All right, Don. Well, we've gone through a litany of very basic but very crucial items of manipulating files, working with files. We've copied, we've moved them, we've deleted them, we've done a lot of stuff. You've shown us expansion, which was a great thing because it helps us minimize the amount of typing and time that it's going to take to make a lot of stuff, or just move stuff or whatever it is we're doing. As you say, it works so ubiquitously through our bash system. It can be very helpful in a lot of great places. Is there anything else you want to enlighten our audience with before we go? We're running short on time.
Well, I know I've made this comment in some of the other episodes, but we've really just scratched the tip of the iceberg, right? It's kind of an introductory, getting used to it. So there are a ton of other commands that are out there that are incredibly useful that you'll use all the time. But these are kind of the core ones, the base ones, the ones that you're expected to know. And more importantly, because they're core utilities, these are present everywhere. So if you go to a BSD machine or a Linux machine, if it's Ubuntu or Fedora or Red Hat, if you go to a Solaris machine, Oracle Linux, whatever, these commands are there. These same commands, the same way that we manipulate things. So this is a consistent set of core utilities that you'll always have. The fancier bells and whistles are great, but you don't necessarily always have those. So this is kind of that starting point for manipulating files.
All right, great stuff, Don. We do appreciate your time and effort into this show and all the great examples that you showed us, the demonstrations. They were really well executed and explained, and that's the important part. Hopefully you guys out there that are watching this are like, man, I'm eating this up. I can run me some Linux now. That's kind of the purpose of why we're doing this for you folks out there. Don, thanks again for joining us, and we do thank you for watching. But looking at the clock, we have dwindled down to nothing yet again for another show. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.